When Marcus couldn't find a babysitter for his job interview, he brought his 6-year-old son along and waited in the lobby. But when the CEO walked out and saw the little boy teaching himself to read with torn picture books, everything changed in ways neither father nor son could have imagined. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The phone buzzed against the cracked kitchen counter at 7:43 a.m., 3 hours and 17 minutes before the most important interview of Marcus Rivera's life. He knew it was bad news before he even looked at the screen. Good news. Didn't call this early, not when you were hanging on by threads so thin they might snap if you breathed too hard. I'm so sorry. Marcus, came Mrs. Rodriguez's voice through the static. She sounded genuinely apologetic, but apologies didn't change facts. My daughter went into labor early. I have to drive to Phoenix right now. Marcus closed his eyes, phone still pressed against his ear, and felt the familiar weight of the world settling back onto his shoulders. Mrs. Rodriguez had been watching Jamie for 2 years now, ever since Elena died, ever since his life became a careful balancing act between survival and sanity. She was reliable, affordable, and most importantly, Jamie loved her. But babies didn't wait for convenient timing, and neither did desperation. I understand, he said, though understanding didn't make it hurt less. Family first. He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment, watching the screen fade to black. In the reflection, he could see Jamie's bedroom door behind him, still closed, still quiet. His son would sleep for another hour, if Marcus was lucky on more hour before he'd have to explain why their carefully constructed world was about to shift again. The interview was at 11 a.m. sharp. Meridian Industries, downtown, 37th floor. A facilities management position that paid more in a year than Marcus had made in the last 2 combined. Benefits, stability, the kind of job that came with business cards and coffee breaks instead of hard hats and 12-hour shifts in the sun. The kind of job that could mean Jamie wouldn't have to wear shoes with holes in them anymore, wouldn't have to pretend he wasn't hungry when the groceries ran thin at the end of the month. Marcus had spent 3 weeks preparing for this interview. He'd practiced answers in the bathroom mirror, researched the company until he could recite their mission statement in his sleep, and borrowed a suit from his brother-in-law that almost fit if he didn't breathe too deeply. The jacket hung a little loose in the shoulders, the pants were a touch short, but it was clean and pressed and made him look like someone who belonged in an office building instead of a construction site. Now, as he stood in the kitchen surrounded by the quiet desperation of morning, all that preparation felt worthless. He couldn't leave Jamie alone now at 6 years old, not for 4 hours, not when the neighbors barely knew their names and the walls in their apartment complex were thin enough to hear arguments 3 units down. He couldn't take Jamie with him either, not to a corporate interview, not when first impressions mattered more than qualifications, not when he was already walking in as an outsider, trying to convince Suits that a man with calloused hands could handle their clean, air-conditioned world. The rent notice was still taped to the refrigerator, red letters screaming, "Final notice," like an accusation he couldn't escape. 3 weeks late, with late fees that grew like weeds. The landlord had been patient, more patient than Marcus deserved, but patience had limits, and they'd reached theirs 2 phone calls ago. Marcus moved to the window, pulling back the thin curtain to stare at the parking lot below. His truck sat in the same spot it had occupied for 3 months now, ever since the construction company downsized and his pink slip became another piece of paper he couldn't afford to frame. The truck ran, barely, but gas cost money and hope had become a luxury he couldn't budget for. He'd been out of work before construction was feast or famine, always had been. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just responsible for himself. This time, a 6-year-old boy was counting on him to figure it out, to be the father Elena had believed he could be, to keep the promises he'd whispered in hospital waiting rooms when the world felt like it was ending. Elena would have known what to do. She always did. She had this way of turning impossible situations into manageable problems, of finding solutions in places Marcus never thought to look. She would have called someone a friend, a neighbor, a stranger who owed her a favor from years ago. Elena collected people the way some people collected stamps, and when she died, Marcus realized how alone he'd always been without her network of connections. The sound of small feet padding across hardwood pulled him from the window. Jamie appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair sticking up in directions that defied physics, rubbing sleep from his eyes with the back of his hand. He wore dinosaur pajamas that had seen better months, the kind with holes in the knees and sleeves that had been rolled up so many times they stayed that way permanently. "Morning, Dad," Jamie said, his voice still thick with sleep. He climbed onto the kitchen chair, legs swinging freely beneath him, and looked expectantly at the empty counter where breakfast should have been waiting. Marcus felt something crack in his chest. Not break, he'd learned the difference over the past 2 years, just crack, like ice under pressure that hadn't quite given way yet. Jamie never complained about the empty counter, never asked why breakfast took longer these days, never mentioned that the cereal boxes got lighter and the milk cartons stayed emptier than they used to. "Morning, buddy," Marcus said, moving toward the refrigerator with practiced efficiency. "How about some cereal? The good kind or the grown-up kind?" Jamie asked, referring to the generic cornflakes that tasted like cardboard but cost half as much as anything with a cartoon character on the box. "Good kind today," Marcus lied, pouring the last of the name-brand cereal into a bowl that had once been part of a set but now stood alone. "Special occasion." Jamie's face lit up with the kind of joy that came from small victories, from moments when the world decided to be kind instead of cruel. He ate slowly, making each bite last, unconsciously savoring what he couldn't name but somehow understood might not come again soon. Marcus watched his son eat and felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling between his shoulder blades. 6 years old, and Jamie had already learned to appreciate what other kids took for granted. 6 years old, and he'd developed the kind of quiet resilience that children shouldn't need, the ability to find happiness in the spaces between hardship. "Dad?" Jamie said between bites, milk dripping from his spoon. "Are you going to work today?" The question hit harder than it should have. Jamie had stopped asking about work months ago, had learned not to mention the empty toolbox in the hall closet or the way Marcus sometimes stared at job listings until his eyes burned. But hope had a way of sneaking back in, especially in children who hadn't learned yet that sometimes hoping hurt more than not trying at all. "I have a meeting," Marcus said carefully. "An important one." Jamie nodded solemnly, as if he understood the weight of important meetings, the way they could change everything or nothing depending on how the words fell. "Will you wear the nice clothes?" "Yeah, buddy. The nice clothes." Marcus finished his coffee instant, black, the kind that left a bitter aftertaste but cost less than the alternative, and tried to calculate options he didn't have. Call in sick? Reschedule? Explain the situation and hope corporate America had developed a sudden understanding of single parenthood? He'd already rescheduled once, 2 weeks ago, when Jamie caught whatever flu was making rounds at the elementary school. The HR representative had been polite but cool, professional in the way that suggested second chances didn't come with third opportunities. This was it. Show up or give up. Perform or disappear back into the stack of resumes that never got called back. The clock on the microwave glowed 8:47 a.m., 2 hours and 13 minutes. Jamie finished his cereal and carried the bowl to the sink without being asked, standing on his toes to reach the counter. He'd learned to be helpful in ways that broke Marcus's heart taking care of himself because he sensed, with the intuition that children possessed, that his father was carrying enough weight for both of them. "Can I watch cartoons?" Jamie asked, already reaching for the remote to the second-hand television that only got basic channels. "Sure," Marcus said. "But quietly, okay? Dad needs to think." Jamie nodded and settled onto the couch, remote in hand, legs tucked beneath him. He found a show about talking animals and turned the volume down to barely audible. Another small act of consideration that shouldn't have been necessary but was desperately appreciated. Marcus returned to the kitchen window, phone in hand, scrolling through contacts that led nowhere. His brother lived 3 states away. His parents had been gone for years. Elena's family had retreated after the funeral, well-meaning but overwhelmed by their own grief, unable to bridge the gap between intention and action. The few friends he'd maintained from before marriage, before fatherhood, before Losh had their own lives, their own problems, their own children to worry about. Asking for help had become harder each time he'd needed it, pride mixing with shame until the words stuck in his throat like stones. 9:15 a.m. Marcus walked to his bedroom and stood before the closet that held his interview outfit. The borrowed suit, the one dress shirt that still had all its buttons, the tie he'd learned to knot from a YouTube video the night before. He touched the fabric, feeling the weight of possibility and desperation sewn into every thread. This job could change everything. Full-time hours, health insurance, a salary that came with vacation days and sick leave and the luxury of planning more than a week ahead. It was the kind of position that could transform them from surviving to living, from counting pennies to saving dollars, from hoping for stability to actually having it. But it required showing up alone, professional, unencumbered by the realities of single parenthood. It required being the kind of candidate who could commit fully to corporate demands, who didn't have to leave early for school pickups or miss meetings for pediatric appointments. It required pretending to be someone he wasn't, at least long enough to get hired. 9:32 a.m. Marcus made his decision the way desperate men always did, not with logic or planning, but with the kind of reckless hope that came from having no alternatives left. He would take Jamie with him. He would find a way to make it work. He would explain the situation if anyone asked, and pray that corporate America had more compassion than its reputation suggested. "Jamie," he called, walking back to the living room. "We're going on an adventure." Jamie looked up from the television, interest flickering in his dark eyes. Adventures were rare in their carefully budgeted world, usually reserved for trips to the library or walks through the park that didn't cost admission. "What kind of adventure?" Jamie asked, remote still in his small hands. "The kind where you get to see a really tall building and sit in a fancy lobby while Dad has that important meeting I mentioned." Jamie considered this, head tilted with the seriousness he applied to all new information. "Will there be elevators?" "Lots of them." "Can I push the buttons?" Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, just slightly. "We'll see what we can do." Jamie clicked off the television and bounded toward his bedroom with the enthusiasm that 6-year-olds brought to unexpected changes in routine. Marcus followed, pulling clothes from drawers that stuck and hangers that bent under minimal weight. "Wear your good jeans," Marcus instructed, "and the blue shirt. The one without holes." Jamie dressed himself with the efficiency he'd learned from necessity. No complaints about the limited wardrobe or the socks that didn't quite match. He combed his hair with water from the bathroom sink, trying to tame the cowlick that had inherited from Elena's side of the family. Marcus dressed carefully. Each piece of clothing, a small transformation from construction worker to corporate candidate. The suit felt foreign against his skin, too clean, too structured, like armor designed for battles he'd never fought. The tie sat awkwardly against his throat, a silk noose that reminded him he was playing a part in someone else's theater. 10:15 a.m. They gathered the essentials. Jamie's backpack with coloring books and crayons, the collection of worn picture books that served as entertainment and education, a small bag of crackers that would have to serve as lunch if the interview ran long. Marcus checked his pocket for the printed copy of his resume, the list of references who would vouch for his work ethic if not his white-collar experience, the directions to the building that loomed in his mind like a monument to everything he'd never been. The truck started on the second try, engine coughing before settling into its familiar rough idle. Marcus had learned to interpret its moods, to coax cooperation from machinery that had seen better decades. It would get them downtown, probably, barring any mechanical rebellions that he couldn't afford to fix. Jamie buckled himself into the passenger seat, feet dangling well above the floor, hands already reaching for the radio dial. He found a station playing pop music and hummed along to songs he'd heard in grocery stores and waiting rooms, content with melodies he didn't fully understand, but enjoyed nonetheless. The drive downtown took them through neighborhoods that shifted like chapters in a book Marcus couldn't afford to buy. Past the apartment complexes where laundry hung from balconies and children played in parking lots, past the strip malls with vacant storefronts and hand-painted signs advertising services in multiple languages, past the invisible line where the city began to clean itself up for visitors who might have money to spend. The buildings grew taller as they approached the business district, glass and steel monuments to industries Marcus only understood from the outside. Meridian Industries occupied floors 35 through 42 of a tower that scraped the morning sky, its lobby visible through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the sun like promises of prosperity. Marcus found parking 3 blocks away, feeding quarters into a meter that demanded more money than he'd budgeted for breathing space. The walk gave him time to rehearse his explanation one more time, to practice the tone that might convince a receptionist that bringing a child to a corporate interview was a sign of resourcefulness rather than desperation. Jamie walked beside him, hand in his father's, neck craned back to stare at buildings that towered over his small world, like benevolent giants. His questions came in a steady stream: how many people worked in each building, whether anyone lived at the top, if the elevators ever got tired of going up and down all day. Marcus answered what he could, grateful for the distraction, for Jamie's ability to find wonder in circumstances that terrified his father. 6 years old, and already more adaptable than most adults, more willing to embrace uncertainty as adventure rather than threat. The lobby of Meridian Industries opened before them like a cathedral dedicated to commerce. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, ceiling that disappeared into shadows far above, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a waiting area. The receptionist sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, her smile professional and perfectly calibrated for people who belonged in places like this. Marcus approached the desk with Jamie's hand still in his, trying to project confidence while his stomach performed acrobatics that would have impressed a circus performer. The receptionist's eyes flicked from Marcus to Jamie and back again, her expression remaining neutral but curious. "Marcus Rivera," he said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I have an 11 a.m. interview with Ms. Chen." The receptionist consulted her computer screen, fingers dancing across keys that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly grocery budget. "Yes, Mr. Rivera. You're a few minutes early." Her gaze settled on Jamie, who was staring up at the lobby ceiling with unconcealed amazement. "Will you be needing accommodation for your son?" The question landed like a test Marcus hadn't studied for. Accommodation could mean understanding, or it could mean polite rejection wrapped in corporate speak. He chose honesty, partly from principle and partly from lack of alternatives. "My babysitter had a family emergency this morning," he said. "I was hoping Jamie could wait in the lobby during the interview. He's very quiet, very well behaved." The receptionist's expression softened slightly, humanity creeping past professional protocols. She glanced around the lobby, assessing the space as if seeing it through the eyes of a 6-year-old for the first time. "I think we can manage that," she said. "There's a seating area by the windows where he'll be comfortable. The interview should take about an hour." Marcus felt his shoulders drop half an inch, tension he hadn't realized he was carrying, releasing just enough to let him breathe properly. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." "No problem," the receptionist said. "We've all been there." She directed them to a cluster of chairs near the floor, to ceiling windows that offered a view of the city spread below like a living map. Jamie settled into a chair that dwarfed his small frame, backpack at his feet, already reaching for the coloring books that would serve as his entertainment for the next hour. Marcus knelt beside the chair, adjusting Jamie's collar unnecessarily, buying time before he had to walk away and trust that his son would be safe in this alien environment. "Remember what we talked about," Marcus said quietly. "Stay in this area, keep your voice down, and if anyone asks, you tell them your dad is in a meeting upstairs." Jamie nodded solemnly, already opening his first coloring book to a page featuring a dinosaur that needed urgent attention from his green crayon. "I'll be good, Dad." "Don't worry." The words hit Marcus harder than they should have. 6 years old, and Jamie had learned to take care of himself in situations where adults should have been taking care of him. 6 years old, and he was already carrying responsibilities that belonged to someone else. Marcus stood, smoothing his borrowed suit one final time, and looked down at his son, coloring quietly in a chair designed for people 3 times his size. Jamie looked small but not lost, calm but not resigned. He looked like a child who had learned to find his place in spaces that weren't built for him, and that realization filled Marcus with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. "I'll be back soon," Marcus said. "I know," Jamie replied without looking up from his coloring. "Good luck, Dad." Marcus walked toward the elevator bank, each step carrying him further from his son and closer to a future that felt simultaneously within reach and impossible to grasp. The elevator doors opened like a mouth ready to swallow his hopes, and as he stepped inside and pressed the button for the 37th floor, he carried with him the image of Jamie coloring quietly by the window, small hands steady on crayons that had seen better days, creating something beautiful in a world that hadn't always been kind to either of them. The elevator rose, carrying Marcus toward possibility and leaving Jamie below, safe in a lobby that suddenly felt less like a corporate monument and more like a waiting room where futures were decided by the courage to show up, even when showing up meant bringing everything you couldn't afford to leave behind. The lobby of Meridian Industries hummed with the quiet efficiency of corporate success. Phones buzzed softly at the reception desk, elevator doors whispered open and closed with mechanical precision, and conversations floated through the air in muted tones that suggested important decisions were being made somewhere above. Marcus sat in the leather chair beside Jamie, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white, watching the minutes tick by on his phone screen like countdown to Judgment Day. 10:47 a.m. 13 minutes early was good. It showed respect for their time, eagerness without desperation. At least, that's what the career advice websites had told him during those long nights when sleep wouldn't come and job applications felt like prayers sent into the void. But now, sitting in this cathedral of commerce with his 6-year-old son coloring quietly beside him, 13 minutes felt like 13 hours. Jamie had settled into his routine with the quiet efficiency that always amazed Marcus. The worn backpack sat open at his feet like a treasure chest, revealing the careful collection of entertainment that would need to sustain him through the next hour. 3 picture books with covers that had been taped back together more than once, a box of crayons that had been whittled down to stubs through months of careful use, and a small notebook where Jamie practiced writing his letters with the dedication of a monk copying scripture. The first book Jamie pulled out was about a little train that could, its pages soft with handling, the corners rounded from being carried in backpacks and read under blankets during thunderstorms. Marcus had found it in the bargain bin at a dollar store 6 months ago, along with the other stories about brave mice and kind elephants and children who discovered they were stronger than they knew. Jamie treated them like sacred texts, opening each one with the reverence of someone who understood that books were doorways to places bigger than the small world they currently inhabited. "Look, Dad," Jamie whispered, pointing to a page where the little train was struggling up a steep mountain. "He's trying really hard, just like you." The comparison hit Marcus somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where love and worry tangled together into something that felt too big for his ribcage. Jamie saw connections everywhere between storybook characters and real life, between his father's struggles and triumphs in picture books, between the small acts of courage that defined their daily existence and the grand adventures that filled his bedtime stories. Marcus reached over and smoothed down a cowlick in Jamie's hair, the same stubborn piece that had defied gravity since the day he was born. "That's right, buddy. Sometimes you just have to keep trying, even when the hill looks really steep, and then you make it to the top," Jamie said with the absolute certainty that 6-year-olds brought to fundamental truths. "And then you can see everything." A woman in a charcoal suit clicked past them on heels that announced her importance with every step. She glanced down at Jamie, her expression flickering between curiosity and something that might have been disapproval before settling on polite indifference. Her briefcase looked like it cost more than Marcus's rent, and her watch caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows like a small star attached to her wrist. Marcus felt the familiar heat of self-consciousness creep up his neck. He was acutely aware of how they must look the man in the borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, the child with the patched backpack and the second-hand clothes, both of them occupying space in a world that operated on different principles than the one they knew. But Jamie seemed oblivious to the scrutiny, lost in his book, reading aloud in a voice barely above a whisper about trains that believed in themselves even when no one else did. 10:52 a.m. The elevator banks delivered a steady stream of corporate citizensmen and women who moved with the confidence that came from knowing exactly where they belonged, from paychecks that arrived with predictable regularity, from lives that operated according to schedules they controlled rather than chaos they endured. Marcus watched them and tried to imagine himself among them, tried to picture walking through these halls with purpose instead of desperation, carrying briefcases filled with important documents instead of resumes that highlighted gaps and explained absences. A security guard made his rounds, nodding politely at familiar faces, his gaze lingering a moment longer on Marcus and Jamie before moving on. Not hostile, just observant, the way people looked at things that didn't quite fit the established pattern. Marcus straightened in his chair, trying to project the kind of calm confidence that belonged in places like this, but his heart was beating so hard he was certain everyone could hear it, echoing off the marble walls. Jamie finished the train book and carefully returned it to his backpack before selecting the next one, a story about a mouse who wanted to be a knight. He opened it with the same gentle care, running his small fingers along the cracked spine before settling in to read. His lips moved silently as he worked through the words, occasionally sounding out longer ones in a whisper that only Marcus could hear. "Courageous," Jamie murmured, finger tracing under the letters. The mouse was courageous. "That's a big word," Marcus said, grateful for any distraction from the clock that seemed to be moving both too fast and too slow simultaneously. "It means brave," Jamie explained without looking up. "Like when you're scared, but you do it anyway." Marcus studied his son's profile, the way his dark eyelashes curved against his cheek, the small furrow of concentration that appeared between his eyebrows when he encountered challenging words. 6 years old and already understanding concepts that some adults spent lifetimes avoiding, Jamie had learned about courage the hard way. Through hospitals and funerals and nights when the electricity got turned off and they played games by candlelight until morning came and brought solutions they couldn't see in the dark. "You're pretty courageous." "To yourself," Marcus said quietly. Jamie looked up then, book still open in his lap, and gave his father the kind of smile that made everything else the borrowed suit, the judging glances, the crushing weight of financial pressure fade into background noise. "We both are." That's what Mom always said. The mention of Elena landed like it always did, with a mixture of warmth and ache that time had softened but never erased. She had said that, in those final weeks when courage was the only thing any of them had left, when hoping required more strength than any of them should have needed to summon. 10:56 a.m. A man in an expensive suit walked past, talking loudly into a Bluetooth earpiece about quarterly projections and market analyses. His voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to being heard, to having opinions that mattered in rooms where decisions got made. He glanced at Jamie, and for a moment his expression softened not with pity, but with something like recognition, as if he remembered being 6 years old and finding himself in places that seemed too big and too important for small hands and curious questions. "Excuse me," the man said, pausing beside their chairs and addressing Jamie directly. "What are you reading?" Jamie looked up, book still open, and held it up so the man could see the cover. "It's about a mouse who wants to be a knight. He's really small, but he doesn't let that stop him." The man's smile was genuine now, cutting through whatever corporate mask he'd been wearing moments before. "That sounds like a good story. I bet he makes a pretty great knight." "He does," Jamie said with absolute conviction. "He saves everyone, even the people who said he was too little. Sometimes the smallest people do the biggest things," the man said, and his eyes met Marcus's for a brief momenta look that carried understanding, respect, maybe even encouragement. Then he continued on his way, his phone conversation resuming with talk of growth margins and strategic initiatives. Marcus felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Not everyone here was judging them. Some people still remembered what it felt like to be small in a big world, still recognized courage when they saw it, even when it came in the form of a 6-year-old with a worn backpack and stories about mice who refused to stay in their assigned places. Jamie returned to his book, but Marcus could sense his son's awareness of the approaching hour, the way children always seem to know when important moments were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Jamie's reading became more focused, more intentional, as if he was trying to absorb as much story as possible before the real world required his attention. 10:58 a.m. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his brother. "How's the interview going?" The message was well-intentioned, but it reminded Marcus that he hadn't even started yet, that everything still hung in the balance, that this morning could end with celebration or devastating disappointment. He typed back a quick, "About to start," and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The receptionist looked up from her computer and made eye contact with Marcus, giving him a subtle nod that meant his time was approaching. His stomach performed another series of acrobatics, and he had to consciously regulate his breathing to keep from hyperventilating in the middle of a corporate lobby. Jamie seemed to sense the shift in energy. He closed his book carefully and looked up at his father with eyes that carried far too much understanding for someone who should have been worried about nothing more serious than whether there would be chocolate milk with lunch. "You're nervous," Jamie observed, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. Marcus didn't see any point in denying it. Jamie had lived through enough adult anxiety to recognize the signs: the way his father's leg bounced when he sat still too long, the way his hands moved restlessly when he was trying not to fidget, the way his smile became just a little too bright when he was trying to hide his worry. "A little," Marcus admitted. "This is a really important meeting." Jamie reached over and patted his father's arm with the grave seriousness that children brought to moments when they recognized that adult emotions needed tending. "You're going to do good. You always do good when things are important." The simple faith in those words nearly undid Marcus completely. Jamie had no reason to believe that, statistically speaking. Important things hadn't been going well for them. Lately jobs had disappeared, bills had gone unpaid, conversations with landlords had grown increasingly tense. But children operated on different metrics than adults, measuring success by effort rather than outcome, by love rather than money, by the simple fact that someone kept trying even when trying felt impossible. "What if they ask me questions I don't know how to answer?" Marcus asked, surprising himself by voicing the fear that had been circling his thoughts like a vulture for the past 3 weeks. Jamie considered this with the seriousness he applied to all hypothetical problems. "Then you tell them the truth. That's what you always tell me to do." "And what if the truth isn't what they want to hear? Then they're not the right people," Jamie said with a kind of clarity that came from living in a world where complicated adult concepts had been distilled down to simple principles. "The right people want to hear true things." Marcus stared at his son. This small philosopher in dinosaur pajamas, who had somehow managed to articulate something that career counselors and self-help books had been trying to explain for decades. The truth was what he had: the truth of hard work and dedication, of nights spent learning new skills on library computers, of a work ethic forged in concrete and steel, and tempered by the responsibility of raising a child alone. 11:00 a.m. The receptionist stood up from her desk, smoothing her skirt and walking toward them with the kind of purposeful stride that meant business. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, adrenaline flooding his system as if he was about to jump out of an airplane instead of simply talking to people about a job he desperately needed. "Mr. Rivera?" the receptionist said, her voice professional but kind. "Ms. Chen is ready to see you now." Marcus stood up slowly, his legs feeling less stable than they should have after sitting for only 13 minutes. He looked down at Jamie, who was carefully putting his book back in his backpack and arranging his crayons in the neat row that made them easier to find later. "I'll be back in about an hour," Marcus said, kneeling beside Jamie's chair so they were at eye level. "You remember what we talked about? Stay here, be quiet, be polite if anyone talks to me," Jamie recited. "And if anyone asks, you're in an important meeting upstairs." That's right. Marcus hesitated, wanting to say more but not knowing what words would be adequate for this moment. How do you tell a 6-year-old that the next hour might determine whether you could afford to keep the lights on next month? How do you explain that sometimes adults had to leave children in strange places because the alternative was worse? Jamie seemed to understand without explanation. He reached out and hugged his father, small arms wrapping around Marcus's neck with the fierce affection that had sustained them both through 2 years of figuring out how to be a family of 2 instead of 3. "I love you, Dad," Jamie whispered. "You're going to be great." "I love you too, buddy," Marcus whispered back, memorizing the feel of small arms around his neck, the scent of children's shampoo, and the faint smell of crayons that always seemed to cling to Jamie's clothes. "I'll be back before you know it." Marcus stood up, adjusting his borrowed tie one final time, and followed the receptionist toward the elevator banks. As they walked, he turned back once to see Jamie settling into his chair with a new book, legs swinging freely, completely absorbed in a story about a brave little elephant who learned that being different was actually a superpower. The elevator doors opened like a mouth ready to swallow his future, and as Marcus stepped inside and watched the numbers climb toward the 37th floor, he carried with him the image of his son, reading quietly in a chair too big for his small frame. Surrounded by marble and glass and the quiet hum of a world that operated on principles they were still learning to navigate. The elevator rose steadily, carrying Marcus toward possibility while leaving Jamie below in the vast lobby, small but not lost, quiet but not invisible, reading stories about creatures who proved that size had nothing to do with strength, and that courage came in all shapes and size 7 in the form of a 6-year-old boy who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply show up and trust that everything would work out the way it was supposed to. As the elevator doors closed, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the lobby through the glass walls, the marble floors that reflected light like still water, the leather furniture that spoke of comfort and stability, and in the corner by the windows, a small figure bent over a book, reading quietly while his father disappeared into the vertical maze of corporate America, both of them hoping that this time, this moment, this leap of faith would land them somewhere better than where they started. The receptionist smiled at him as the elevator climbed, and Marcus tried to smile back, tried to project the kind of confidence that belonged in places like this. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Jamie, alone in that vast space, surrounded by strangers and marble and the weight of adult decisions that children shouldn't have to carry, but somehow always did. 37 floors up, the future waited behind conference room doors, and careful questions about gaps in employment and explanations for why a construction worker thought he could succeed in corporate facilities management. But 37 floors down, in a lobby that suddenly felt less like a cathedral and more like a waiting room, a 6-year-old boy read stories about courage and believed absolutely that his father would succeed, because that's what fathers did when their children needed them to. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 37th floor, and Marcus stepped out into a hallway lined with offices where important decisions got made every day. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his borrowed suit one final time, and walked toward the conference room where his future was waiting, carrying with him the absolute faith of a 6-year-old who believed that good things happened to people who worked hard and told the truth and never stopped trying. Even when the mountain looked too steep to climb, behind him the elevator doors whispered closed, carrying his hopes upward, while leaving his heart behind in a lobby chair beside a backpack full of books and the quiet certainty that love was the only qualification that really mattered, no matter what the job description said. 37 floors above the marble lobby, Marcus Rivera sat across from 3 people whose expressions gave away nothing about what they thought of his answers. The conference room smelled like expensive coffee and the kind of leather that came from furniture catalogs he'd never be able to afford. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that made everything below look manageable, orderly, like problems that could be solved with the right perspective and enough elevation. "So, Mr. Rivera," said the woman to his left, consulting a tablet that reflected his resume in stark black text. There's a gap here from March 2022 to August 2023. Can you help us understand what happened during that period? Marcus felt his throat tighten. This was the question he'd rehearsed a dozen different ways, the explanation that never sounded adequate no matter how he framed it. The truth was complicated grief and hospitals, and a 6-year-old who needed his father more than any job could provide. But corporate America preferred simple answers, clean narratives that fit neatly into boxes marked reliable or unemployable. My wife was sick, Marcus said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. Cancer. The treatment required someone to be available for appointments, for care, for. He paused, searching for words that could contain the weight of watching someone you love disappear by degrees. She passed away in February 2022. After that, I needed time to figure out how to be a single parent. The silence that followed felt heavy, loaded with the kind of discomfort that came when professional settings collided with human reality. The three interviewers exchanged glances that spoke in corporate shorthand language of liability and scheduling conflicts, and the unspoken understanding that personal tragedies, however sympathetic, created complications that clean resumes didn't. Meanwhile, 37 floors below, Jamie Rivera had finished his second book and was carefully selecting his third when the elevator doors whispered open and deposited someone new into the marble cathedral of the lobby. He didn't look up immediately. He'd learned to be invisible in spaces like this, to make himself small enough that adults could pretend he belonged to someone else, somewhere else, anywhere that wasn't their immediate responsibility. Victoria Chen emerged from the elevator with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence that came from building something from nothing, from transforming ideas into industries and possibilities into paychecks for 3,000 employees. Her suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that whispered rather than shouted about success. But there was something else in her Baringa watchfulness, an awareness that came from remembering what it felt like to be the outsider looking in. She'd been heading toward the parking garage, keys already in hand, when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A child, alone in the lobby, bent over a book with the kind of focused concentration that Victoria remembered from her own childhood, the desperate absorption of someone for whom books were windows to everywhere else. Victoria paused by the reception desk, ostensibly checking her phone but actually observing. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, dark hair falling across his forehead as he read, lips moving silently as he worked through words that challenged his vocabulary. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of careful hand-me-downs that spoke of love stretched thin over economic reality. His shoes had been polished recently, but the leather cracked at the creases where growing feet had tested the limits of what could be made to last. What struck Victoria most was his posture, not the fidgeting restlessness of most children his age, but the contained stillness of someone who had learned to occupy space without claiming it, to exist without taking up more room than absolutely necessary. It was a posture she recognized from her own reflection 35 years ago, when her grandmother would take her to the bank or the insurance office and she would sit quietly while adult problems got discussed in code above her head. Perseverance, Jamie sounded out quietly, finger tracing under the letters. Perseverance. Victoria found herself taking a step closer, drawn by the boy's determination to master a word that many adults struggled to embody. He was reading about a turtle who refused to give up racing against faster animals, moving his lips as he worked through sentences that tested the boundaries of his reading level. The security guard, making his afternoon rounds, noticed the boy and started walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that meant questions were about to be asked. Victoria intercepted him before he could reach Jamie's chair. "It's all right, David," she said quietly. "He's with someone who's upstairs." David nodded, recognizing both her authority and her toneath, one that suggested further questions would be unwelcome. He continued his rounds, and Victoria found herself standing alone beside the seating area, watching a child read with the dedication of a scholar attacking ancient texts. Jamie turned the page carefully, treating the worn book like the precious thing it was. The cover had been reinforced with clear tape, and the pages showed the soft edges that came from being read and reread until the words became friends rather than strangers. Victoria could see other books in his open backpack, a small library of dollar store treasures that had been chosen for content rather than condition. The turtle was tired, Jamie read aloud in a whisper, but he remembered what his grandfather had told him about finishing what you start. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. She thought about her own grandfather, who had died when she was 8, but had lived long enough to plant seeds about persistence and dignity that had grown into the woman she'd become. She thought about the hours she'd spent in waiting rooms and lobbies, reading whatever books she could find while her grandmother worked multiple jobs to keep them housed and fed. Almost without conscious decision, Victoria walked to the chair adjacent to Jamie's and sat down quietly. She didn't speak, didn't intrude on his reading, just settled into the leather seat and pulled out her phone as if she had business to conduct in the lobby of her own building. Jamie glanced up at the movement, dark eyes taking in this new presence with the careful assessment children applied to unfamiliar adults. Victoria offered a small smile, the kind that said, "I'm not going to bother you," rather than, "Let me help you," and Jamie returned it with the shy politeness that had been drilled into him through necessity. He went back to his book, but Victoria could sense his awareness of her proximity. Children were natural observers, and Jamie had learned to read adults the way he read his books carefully, looking for clues about intention and safety, and whether this new person represented help or harm. "Extraordinary," Jamie whispered, working through another challenging word. The turtle did something extraordinary. Victoria found herself leaning slightly forward, drawn into the quiet drama of a 6-year-old conquering language one syllable at a time. There was something beautiful about his process, the way he refused to skip words he didn't know, the determination to understand rather than simply move past obstacles. "That's a big word," Victoria said softly, not wanting to startle him but unable to resist acknowledging his achievement. Jamie looked up, book still open in his lap, and studied her with the directness that children brought to conversations before they learned that eye contact could be threatening. "It means really, really special," he said. "Like when someone does something amazing, even though it's really hard." "That's exactly right," Victoria said, impressed by both his definition and his confidence in sharing it. "Are you here by yourself?" Jamie shook his head. "My dad's upstairs having an important meeting. I'm waiting for him." The simple explanation carried weight that Victoria suspected the child didn't fully understand. An important meeting in a building like this usually meant someone's future hanging in the balance, dreams and desperation dressed up in interview clothes and carefully practiced answers. "That must be a very important meeting," Victoria said carefully. Jamie nodded solemnly. "He's trying to get a job so we can stay in our apartment. The landlord isn't very patient anymore." The honesty hit Victoria like a physical blow. Children had no filters for information that adults learned to guard carefully, no understanding that some truths were too raw to share with strangers. But there was something refreshing about Jamie's openness, something that cut through the corporate speak and polite deflections that filled most of her conversations. "What kind of job is your dad looking for?" Victoria asked. "Something with buildings," Jamie said. "He's really good at fixing things and making them work better. He used to build houses, but then Mom got sick and he had to stop working to take care of her." He paused, turning a page in his book. "She died, but Dad says she's still with us in here." He pointed to his chest, over his heart. Victoria felt her breath catch. The matter-of-fact way Jamie delivered information that would have reduced most adults to tears spoke to a resilience that shouldn't have been necessary, but clearly was. She thought about her own childhood losses, the way grief became a companion rather than a visitor when you were too young to understand that some wounds were supposed to heal completely. "I'm sorry about your mom," Victoria said gently. "That must have been very difficult." Jamie nodded, but not with sadness, with the acceptance that came from living with reality rather than fighting it. "Dad says she taught us how to be brave. She used to read to me every night, just like this." He held up his book. "Now I read to myself, but sometimes I pretend she's still listening." Victoria had to look away for a moment, ostensibly checking something on her phone, but actually blinking back tears that had no place in a corporate lobby. When she looked back, Jamie was studying her with curious eyes. "Are you sad?" he asked with the directness that adults had learned to avoid. "You look like my dad when he thinks about Mom." "A little," Victoria admitted. "Sometimes when people tell me important stories, it makes me think about people I miss too." Jamie nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. "Dad says missing people means you love them really big, so being sad is kind of like still loving them." The wisdom in that statement left Victoria momentarily speechless. She'd heard similar sentiments from grief counselors and self-help books, but hearing it distilled through the clarity of a 6-year-old's understanding gave it a power that professional consolation had never achieved. "Your dad sounds like a very smart man," Victoria said. "He is," Jamie agreed without hesitation. "He knows how to fix almost everything. Cars, sinks, the heater when it makes weird noises. He taught me how to use tools, but only the safe ones." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small toy screwdriver, obviously well-loved and carefully maintained. "This was my mom's when she was little. Now it's mine." Victoria examined the tiny tool, noting how Jamie handled it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "What do you fix with it?" "Broken toys, mostly. Sometimes the kitchen chair when it gets wobbly. Dad says every problem has a solution if you're patient enough to find it." Jamie slipped the screwdriver back into his backpack with careful precision. "He's really patient. Even when things are scary, he doesn't give up." The admiration in Jamie's voice was absolute, untainted by the kind of complicated emotions that often colored adult relationships. Victoria found herself wondering about Marcus Rivera, this father who had inspired such unconditional faith in a child who had already lived through more loss than most adults. "What's scary right now?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jamie considered the question with the seriousness he applied to difficult vocabulary words. "Money, mostly. Dad doesn't like to talk about it, but I hear him on the phone sometimes with the landlord and the electric company. They use angry voices." He looked up at Victoria with eyes that held too much understanding. "Dad works really hard, but sometimes hard work isn't enough if there aren't jobs that need doing." The observation was delivered with such matter-of-fact clarity that Victoria felt something crack in her chest. This child understood economic realities that many adults preferred to ignore, had learned to live with uncertainty that would send most people into therapy. "Is that why today's meeting is so important?" Victoria asked. Jamie nodded. "Dad says this might be our last chance to find something good. He's been looking for a long time." He paused, returning to his book for a moment before looking back up. "But I think it's going to work out. Dad's really good at things, even if other people don't always see it right away." The faith in Jamie's voice was unshakable, built on a foundation of love that had survived loss and poverty, and the thousand small indignities that came with being at the mercy of other people's decisions. Victoria found herself hoping desperately that this child's faith would be rewarded, that the universe would choose this moment to demonstrate that good things really did happen to people who deserved them. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Victoria asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to steer the conversation toward lighter territory. Jamie's face lit up with the first purely childlike expression Victoria had seen from him. "A lot of things. Maybe an engineer, like the people who design buildings. Or a teacher, because I like helping other kids with reading. Or maybe I'll work with Dad, fixing things and making them better." "Those are all wonderful choices," Victoria said. "What made you think about engineering?" "We went to the library once, and there was a book about bridges," Jamie explained, his voice gaining enthusiasm. "It showed how they figure out how to make something strong enough to hold cars and trucks, but still beautiful to look at. Dad said that's what good work does, it's useful and beautiful at the same time." Victoria smiled at the insight. "Your dad is right about that. The best work serves a purpose and creates something meaningful." "Like your work?" Jamie asked with innocent curiosity. "What do you do here?" The question caught Victoria off guard. She'd grown so accustomed to being introduced by title and reputation that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be asked simply, directly, by someone who had no preconceptions about her importance or influence. "I help make sure this building runs well," she said, choosing simplicity over corporate hierarchy. "I make decisions about how we can do our work better and take care of the people who work here." Jamie nodded approvingly. "That sounds important. Do you like it?" "Most days," Victoria said honestly. "Some days are harder than others, especially when I have to make decisions that affect other people's lives." "Like whether Dad gets the job?" Jamie asked with the directness that cut through adult euphemisms like a blade. Victoria felt her breath catch. She hadn't connected the dots until that moment. Thadden realized that the child sitting beside her, reading about courageous turtles and sharing wisdom about love and loss, was connected to the interview happening on the 37th floor. The meeting she'd delegated to her human resources team, the position she'd approved creating but hadn't planned to be personally involved in filling. "Is your last name Rivera?" she asked quietly. Jamie nodded. "Jamie Rivera. That's my dad up there, Marcus Rivera. Do you know him?" Victoria's mind raced through implications and possibilities. She thought about the resume she'd briefly reviewed the night before: construction background, employment gap explained by family illness, references that spoke to work ethic and reliability but not corporate experience. She thought about the calculated risk of hiring someone from outside their industry, the way HR had framed it as a diversity initiative rather than a strategic decision. But sitting here, talking to this remarkable child, Victoria began to understand that some qualifications couldn't be measured on paper. The kind of man who could raise a son like Jamie: wise, resilient, articulate, kind, possessed character traits that no interview process could accurately assess. "I don't know your dad yet," Victoria said carefully, "but I know the company, and I know how important today's meeting is." Jamie's face brightened with hope and excitement. "Really? Are you going to help him get the job?" The innocent question carried the weight of a family's future, the faith of a child who believed that adults in positions of power used that power to help rather than harm. Victoria found herself looking into eyes that held absolute trust in the goodness of strangers, in the possibility that the world might choose kindness over expedience. "I'm going to make sure the right decision gets made," Victoria said, which was both a promise and a commitment she hadn't planned to make when she stepped off the elevator 20 minutes ago. Jamie smiled, not with relief, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose faith had been validated rather than shaken. "I knew you were nice," he said simply. "You have kind eyes, like Mom did." The comparison hit Victoria harder than any compliment she'd received in boardrooms or award ceremonies. To be seen with such clarity by a child who had learned to recognize genuine kindness in a world that hadn't always been kind to him felt like a gift she didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Thank you," Victoria said softly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." Jamie returned to his book, apparently satisfied that he'd done his part to ensure his father's success. Victoria sat beside him in comfortable silence, watching him read about turtles who refused to quit, and elephants who learned that being different was actually a superpower. As she watched this extraordinary child navigate words and concepts with the determination of someone much older, Victoria realized that the interview happening 37 floors above them was no longer just about filling a position. It was about recognizing that some of the most important qualifications, character, resilience, the ability to raise a child like Jamie, couldn't be found in traditional candidates or conventional backgrounds. The elevator dinged softly in the distance, and Victoria knew that soon Marcus Rivera would return to collect his son, probably expecting disappointment and preparing to comfort a child who didn't yet understand that the world wasn't always fair to people who deserved better. But Victoria Chen, CEO of Meridian Industries, had just learned something about courage from a 6-year-old boy with worn books and unshakable faith. And she intended to make sure that lesson translated into something more tangible than wisdom, something that could pay rent and buy groceries, and prove to a remarkable child that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe recognized extraordinary when it saw it. The elevator descended 37 floors, carrying Marcus Rivera back to Earth, with the weight of certain disappointment pressing against his chest like a stone. The interview had not gone well. He could read it in the polite smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes, in the way the questions had shifted from assessing his capabilities to explaining his unconventional path, in the careful silence that followed each of his answers like a verdict waiting to be pronounced. They'd asked about the employment gap, and he'd told them the truth about Elena's illness and death, about choosing to be present for his wife's final months rather than chasing paychecks that couldn't buy more time. They'd nodded with the kind of sympathetic understanding that meant they respected his choice but couldn't quite figure out how to fit it into their corporate framework. Personal tragedy, however noble, created complications that clean hiring decisions preferred to avoid. They'd asked about his transition from construction to facilities management, and Marcus had explained his belief that buildings were buildings, that understanding how things were put together meant understanding how to keep them working, whether you were wearing a hard hat or a business suit. But even as he'd spoken, he could see them calculating the risk of hiring someone without traditional credentials, someone whose references came from job sites rather than boardrooms. The worst part hadn't been the questions themselves, but the growing certainty that he'd brought Jamie into this gleaming corporate cathedral for nothing. His son was sitting alone in that vast lobby, reading worn books, and trusting that his father would somehow transform their circumstances through the power of wanting it badly enough. The faith in Jamie's eyes when he'd said goodbye felt like a weight Marcus wasn't sure he was strong enough to carry home. As the elevator doors opened onto the marble expanse of the lobby, Marcus already began composing the gentle explanation he'd give Jamie about how sometimes things didn't work out the way you hoped, about how they'd figure out another plan, about how love was more important than money, even when money was what kept the lights on. He stepped out of the elevator with his shoulders already curved around the disappointment, his borrowed suit feeling heavier than the work clothes he'd worn for 17 years. But as he walked toward the seating area where he'd left his son, Marcus stopped so abruptly that a woman behind him nearly collided with his suddenly stationary form. The scene before him made no sense, violated every assumption he'd carried with him up 37 floors and back down again. Jamie sat in his chair exactly where Marcus had left him, but he was no longer alone. Beside him, in a chair that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, sat a woman in an elegant charcoal suit. She was leaning slightly toward Jamie, listening with complete attention as he read aloud from one of his worn picture books. Her posture suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, and when Jamie looked up to explain something about the story, she responded with the kind of engaged curiosity that adults usually reserve for other adults. Marcus's first instinct was panic. Jamie was talking to a stranger, sharing stories and probably personal information with someone who might be anyone: a concerned citizen, a security officer, someone with the authority to ask uncomfortable questions about why a 6-year-old was sitting alone in a corporate lobby while his father begged for employment upstairs. Marcus walked toward them quickly, his mind racing through apologies and explanations, preparing to collect his son and retreat before anyone could transform their desperate situation into something that required official intervention. But as he drew closer, something about the woman's demeanor stopped him from immediately sweeping Jamie away. She wasn't interrogating him or looking around for responsible adults. She was simply sitting with him, sharing space and attention as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Jamie," Marcus said as he approached, his voice carrying the careful control of someone trying not to alarm anyone. "I'm back, buddy." Jamie looked up with a smile that held none of the anxiety Marcus had expected. "Dad, this is my new friend. We've been reading together." The woman turned toward Marcus, and he found himself looking into eyes that carried both authority and warmth. The kind of gaze that suggested she was accustomed to making important decisions, but hadn't forgotten what it felt like to need someone else to make them on her behalf. She stood gracefully, extending a hand that spoke of manicures and boardroom confidence. "Mr. Rivera," she said, "I'm Victoria Chen. I've been having the most wonderful conversation with your son." The name hit Marcus like cold water. Victoria Chenthi, CEO, whose signature was on company letterheads, whose decisions affected thousands of employees, whose time was measured in quarters and fiscal years, rather than minutes and conversations with 6-year-olds in corporate lobbies. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and something close to terror. "Ms. Chen," he stammered, reaching for her hand while his mind processed the implications of this encounter. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know, Jamie. You didn't tell me." He looked down at his son, who was watching the interaction with curious eyes that held no understanding of the corporate hierarchy that made this moment either miraculous or catastrophic. "There's nothing to apologize for," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that suggested she was accustomed to putting people at ease, even when they felt entirely out of their depth. "Jamie has been excellent company. We've been discussing literature, engineering, and the fine art of perseverance." Marcus looked between Victoria and Jamie, trying to process how his 6-year-old had ended up discussing engineering with one of the most powerful business leaders in the city. Jamie seemed completely comfortable with the situation, as if conversations with CEOs were a regular part of his afternoon routine. "I should get him out of your way," Marcus said, still operating from the assumption that this encounter was an inconvenience to be minimized rather than a conversation to be celebrated. "I know you must be incredibly busy." "Actually," Victoria said, settling back into her chair as if she had all the time in the world, "I was hoping we could talk. All three of us." Marcus remained standing, uncertain whether sitting would suggest presumption or standing would suggest disrespect. In construction, the hierarchy was clear. Foremen gave orders, workers followed them, and everyone understood their place in the structure. But corporate America operated by rules he'd never learned, in languages he'd never been taught to speak. "Please," Victoria said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Sit." Marcus lowered himself into the leather seat, hyper-aware of how the borrowed suit pulled across his shoulders, how his work-roughened hands looked against the polished surface of the chair's arms. Jamie, oblivious to his father's discomfort, had already returned to his book, occasionally looking up to share observations about the story with Victoria as if they'd been friends for years rather than minutes. "Your interview was this afternoon," Victoria said, not as a question but as a statement that invited explanation. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, defaulting to the formality that felt safest when navigating unfamiliar territory. "For the facilities management position." Victoria nodded. "And how did it go?" Marcus hesitated, caught between honesty and the kind of diplomatic deflection that might preserve what little dignity he had left. But Jamie looked up from his book at that moment, eyes bright with expectation, and Marcus realized that his son deserved truth even when truth was disappointing. "Not well," Marcus admitted. "I think my background might be too different from what they're looking for." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her expression suggesting genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. "Tell me about your background." The request felt like a test, though Marcus couldn't determine what answers might constitute passing or failing. He thought about the practiced responses he'd rehearsed for the interview, the careful way he'd tried to translate construction experience into corporate language. But sitting here with Jamie beside him, those rehearsed answers felt inadequate for a conversation that had already moved beyond conventional boundaries. "I've been in construction for 17 years, Marcus said. "Started as a laborer, worked my way up to crew chief. I understand how buildings work: electrical, plumbing, structural systems, climate control. I know how to manage teams, solve problems, work within budgets and timelines." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I know it's not the same as corporate facilities management, but buildings are buildings. The principles are the same, even if the settings are different." "What made you want to leave construction?" Victoria asked. Marcus glanced at Jamie, who was pretending to read, but obviously listening with the acute attention children brought to conversations about their futures. "I need stability," Marcus said carefully. "Construction is boom and bust good, months and lean months, seasonal work, projects that end without warning. I need something I can count on." Because of Jamie, Victoria said, not as a question but as an understanding. Because of Jamie, Marcus confirmed. He deserves better than wondering whether we'll be able to stay in our apartment from month to month. Victoria nodded slowly, her gaze moving between Marcus and Jamie with an assessment that felt different from the corporate evaluation he'd endured upstairs. This wasn't about checking boxes or measuring qualifications against predetermined criteria. This was about understanding people and stories and the complex mathematics of human need. Jamie tells me you're very good at fixing things, Victoria said. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. He's a little biased. Maybe, Victoria agreed, but children are often more perceptive than adults about what really matters. She turned to Jamie with a smile. What else did you tell me about your dad? Jamie looked up from his book, happy to be included in the conversation. He never gives up, even when things are really hard. And he teaches me that every problem has a solution if you're patient enough to find it. And he makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the whole world. Despite his anxiety, Marcus felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. Trust Jamie to include grilled cheese among his father's professional qualifications. Those sound like important skills, Victoria said seriously. Persistence, problem-solving, and culinary expertise. Jamie nodded solemnly. Dad says the secret to good grilled cheese is low heat and patience. You can't rush it or it burns on the outside but stays cold in the middle. Victoria looked at Marcus with something that might have been amusement. Is that a metaphor for your approach to other problems as well? Marcus found himself relaxing slightly, drawn into a conversation that felt more like getting to know someone than being evaluated by them. I suppose it is. Most things work better when you take the time to do them right, instead of rushing for quick results. Even when you're under pressure? Victoria asked. Especially when you're under pressure, Marcus said. That's when it's most tempting to cut corners, but that's also when cutting corners costs the most. Victoria sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Marcus couldn't read the thoughts behind her eyes, couldn't determine whether this unconventional interview was going better or worse than the formal one he'd endured upstairs. But Jamie seemed comfortable with the silence, returning to his book while the adults processed whatever adult considerations required processing. I started this company 12 years ago, Victoria said finally. I was 28, barely out of business school, with an idea about how facilities management could be more than just maintaining buildings. I wanted to create environments where people could do their best work, where the physical space supported rather than hindered productivity and creativity. Marcus nodded, unsure whether response was expected or whether this was leading somewhere that would require participation or just listening. The first few years were challenging, Victoria continued. I was young, inexperienced, trying to convince established companies to trust someone who looked like she should be asking for internships rather than multi-million-dollar contracts. I made mistakes, lost clients, had to rebuild trust I'd broken through inexperience. She paused, looking out the floor to ceiling windows at the city sprawling below them. But I learned something important during those early years. The most valuable people weren't always the ones with the most impressive resumes or the smoothest presentations. The people who made the biggest difference were the ones who understood that work was about serving something larger than themselves, whether that was clients, colleagues, or families depending on them to succeed. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a cautious hope that he tried to suppress before it could grow large enough to be disappointed. But Victoria's words resonated with something deeper than professional platitudes. They spoke to the way he'd approached every job he'd ever held, every responsibility he'd ever accepted. The position you interviewed for today, Victoria said, is facilities manager for our downtown properties. It's a good job, stable, with benefits and opportunities for advancement. But I'm wondering if it's the right job for someone with your particular combination of skills and motivations. Marcus felt his breath catch. This sounded like the gentle prelude to rejection, the careful way that professional disappointment got wrapped in encouragement and suggestions to keep trying elsewhere. What if, Victoria continued, instead of managing our existing facilities, you helped us reimagine what facilities management could be? What if we created a position that combined your construction background with corporate oversight, someone who could work with our clients to not just maintain their buildings but optimize them for the people who work there. The suggestion landed like something from a foreign language that Marcus almost understood but couldn't quite translate. "I'm not sure I follow." Victoria leaned forward, her voice gaining the energy that came with explaining possibilities rather than limitations. "We have clients who are frustrated with traditional facilities, management too reactive, too focused on problems instead of prevention, too disconnected from the human element of how buildings actually get used. What if we offered something different? Someone who could look at a space and see not just what needed fixing, but what could be improved to make it work better for the people who depend on it." Marcus tried to process the implications of what she was describing. It sounded like consulting, like problem-solving on a larger scale than he'd ever imagined, like the kind of work that would require thinking rather than just doing. "It would mean travel," Victoria continued. "Visits to client sites, meetings with executives and facility teams. It would mean learning new systems, new technologies, new ways of approaching familiar problems. But it would also mean flexible scheduling, the ability to plan your work around Jamie's needs, and compensation that reflects the value you'd bring to our clients." Jamie looked up from his book, sensing that something important was happening even if he didn't understand the details. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you getting a job?" Marcus looked down at his son, then back at Victoria, trying to determine whether this conversation was really happening or whether the stress of the afternoon had finally caused him to hallucinate a more hopeful reality than the one he actually inhabited. "I don't understand," Marcus said carefully. "You don't know me. You don't know whether I can do what you're describing. Why would you offer me something like this based on a conversation in a lobby?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had met her, it reached all the way to her eyes. "Because of him?" she said, nodding toward Jamie. "Because any man who can raise a child like Jamie was, kind, resilient, articulate, possesses qualities that no interview process can measure. Because Jamie told me that you taught him every problem has a solution if you're patient enough to find it, and that's exactly the kind of thinking our clients need." She paused, looking between Marcus and Jamie with an expression that combined professional assessment with something deeper, more personal. "But mostly," Victoria continued, "because 30 minutes ago, I was rushing to my car thinking about quarterly projections and strategic initiatives, and then I sat down with a 6-year-old boy who reminded me why I started this company in the first place. Jamie told me that your mom taught you both how to be brave, and that sometimes being sad is just another way of loving someone. That kind of wisdom about courage, about love, about perseverance, that's what I want representing our company." Marcus felt something break open in his chest, not with pain but with the kind of overwhelming relief that came when the world suddenly made sense again. For months, he'd been trying to transform himself into someone he thought corporate America wanted, carefully editing his story to hide the parts that didn't fit conventional success narratives. But Victoria was telling him that the parts he'd tried to hide, the devotion to Jamie, the choice to prioritize family over career advancement, the hard-won wisdom that came from loss and struggle, were exactly what she valued most. "I don't have corporate experience," Marcus said, still unable to quite believe that this offer was real. "No," Victoria agreed, "but you have something better. You have character. You have the kind of integrity that chooses to bring your son to an interview rather than leave him with someone unsafe, even when that choice might cost you the opportunity. You have the wisdom that comes from understanding what really matters." Jamie had closed his book and was watching the conversation with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for especially interesting stories. "Dad," he said quietly, "I think she likes us." Victoria laughed, a sound that transformed her from corporate executive to someone Marcus could imagine having coffee with. Someone who might understand the complex mathematics of single parenthood and the daily miracle of making love stretch far enough to cover everything that money couldn't buy. "I do like you," Victoria said to Jamie. "Both of you. And I think you're going to like working with us." Marcus looked at his son, this small philosopher who had somehow managed to accomplish in 30 minutes what Marcus had failed to achieve in 30 years of careful professionalism. Jamie had simply been himself, curious, kind, honest about their circumstances, and optimistic about their future, and that authenticity had opened doors that Marcus's practiced interview answers never could have. "When would you need an answer?" Marcus asked, still proceeding cautiously despite the hope that was beginning to unfurl in his chest like something that had been held underwater and was finally allowed to surface. "How about now?" Victoria said. "Unless you need time to think about it." Marcus looked down at Jamie, who was grinning with the kind of pure joy that came from witnessing adults make decisions that changed everything for the better. He thought about the rent notice still taped to their refrigerator, about the bills that accumulated faster than solutions, about the careful rationing of hope that had become their daily routine. But more than that, he thought about the opportunity Victoria was offering, not just a job, but work that would use everything he'd learned from 17 years of construction, from 2 years of single parenthood, from a lifetime of solving problems with patience and persistence rather than panic and shortcuts. "Yes," Marcus said, and the word felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in months. "Yes, absolutely." Jamie launched himself from his chair into his father's arms with the enthusiasm of someone whose faith had been validated in the most spectacular way possible. Marcus caught him, holding him close while trying to process the fact that their lives had just changed completely in the space of a conversation that began with apologies and ended with possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine. "When do I start?" Marcus asked over Jamie's head. "Monday," Victoria said. "But first, we celebrate. I know a place that makes excellent grilled cheese sandwiches, and I think Jamie might have some opinions about whether they meet his father's standards." As they gathered Jamie's books and prepared to leave the marble lobby where their lives had been transformed, Marcus realized that bringing his son to the interview hadn't been a mistake born of desperation. It had been exactly what was supposed to happen, the moment when authenticity met opportunity and created something neither of them could have achieved alone. Victoria walked with them toward the elevator, and as the doors opened to carry them toward a future that suddenly looked brighter than either Marcus or Jamie had dared to hope, Marcus understood that sometimes the most important qualifications really couldn't be found on a resume. Sometimes they lived in the love between a father and son, in the wisdom that came from facing hardship with grace, and in the simple courage to show up as exactly who you were, even when the world seemed to want you to be someone else. The elevator doors closed on 3 people who had found exactly what they needed in the most unexpected way possible. CEO who remembered why she'd started her company, a father who discovered that his greatest strength was the love he'd never learned to hide, and a 6-year-old boy whose faith in the goodness of strangers had just been rewarded in ways that would change all their lives forever.